Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Mr. Secretary, I want to address cybersecurity a little bit, if you don't mind. I know you're making some significant investments there, which is very, very critical. If you could help me understand, and this comes from the previous administration, you'll recall that Sony was hacked in 2014. Soon thereafter, it was determined that North Korea was behind that hack, and sanctions were imposed upon certain individuals, I guess, and companies within North Korea. Help us understand, how does that process work? Is that something that is continuing today? How do you measure success? How does that prevent future attacks? And have you noticed, or did that prevent future attacks? And I guess so I'm speaking of a policy from a previous administration, so you may not be familiar with that. But anything you could share with us on that?
Well, let me just first say that I do spend a significant component of my time looking at cybersecurity issues because Treasury is responsible for the financial infrastructure. Although DHS has overall responsibility, we are focused on financial infrastructure, and that's a very important component of the U.S. economy. So we constantly meet with the banks and other companies, and we very much support a public-private cooperation and effort. I also fully support moving the Secret Service back to Treasury because we will have better coordination on cyber crimes. And I think cybersecurity is an ongoing issue. I feel very comfortable with where we are, but this is a risk that constantly needs to be monitored, and we need to constantly invest in our own cybersecurity and working with our industry. Now, as it relates to sanctions, I think sanctions are one of the many tools. We will continue to look at bad actors that have cyber theft around the world. We recently did some sanctions, but that's just one of the many tools. We need to make sure that our infrastructure is protected, and the sanctions are just one of many tools we would use.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you at all about our infrastructure needs protecting, and I'd be curious maybe your thoughts on what's the government's role in that. And it seems as if a lot of it shifted to the business sector, and that's why I was curious about the sanctions policy of the previous administration. If you've noticed that's had a sizable positive impact on the reduction of breach attempts on U.S. companies, and then maybe if you've noticed, how does that help a U.S. company if a sanction is enforced upon another foreign entity? How does that restore or make whole the U.S. entity? Is there any identifying of how that might work or how that assists that impacted entity here?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the Sony situation only because that was before my time, so I'm aware and have been briefed on it. But again, what I would say is we're much more focused today on both our infrastructure. So in the case of the IRS, one of the reasons we are asking for more money for modernization is part of that is cybersecurity issues. The IRS, unfortunately, as a large institution with a large amount of personal data, is attacked constantly. I'm happy to say that we've been very successful at countering those, but from my perspective, I look at that. I also look at, in the case of, as I said, the financial infrastructure, although it's not our obligation to protect it, we have to monitor it. And again, to the extent we have classified information, we work with private entities to make sure that they can protect themselves.
You referenced the IRS, and there was a successful breach into the IRS, and it was under the previous administration. And I assume a lot of that's been tightened up. Are you aware of anyone that's been prosecuted for that hack?
I'm not aware of it, but we can look into that and get back to you.
And I'm certainly not here to put you on the spot at all. We had before us the Judiciary a few days ago, and I asked them about the number of breach attempts, and I believe it was 24 million attempts last fiscal year, and they made the claim that none had been successful. But I followed up with the question of, well, how many individuals were prosecuted for attempting? And obviously the answer is likely zero. They couldn't identify. And so I'm curious if we need to, as policymakers, begin thinking about cyber policy in a different way. It seems like so much has shifted to the private sector, and yet when you look at how is somebody restored, such as Sony or a Georgia company like Equifax, who is paid or obligated to pay $700 million in fines, and yet they have no opportunity to be restored by those who actually cause the harm. Maybe you could share some with us later on today or in the future about if you have any thoughts on any policy changes we should make. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Yeah,